Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time today talking about prophecy. In studio with me, Dr. Ron Rhodes, with his PhD from Dallas Theological Seminary, an individual that actually teaches not only at Dallas Theological Seminary, but Veritas Evangelical Seminary, president of Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries. And we have a new book out, Bible Prophecy Answer Book, Everything You Need to Know About the End Times, an individual that has been with us for many times in the past, and we will certainly try to answer some of your questions about prophecy today, especially as we look at the Middle East. And let me just mention, if you have not seen this, the United States dropped what many people call the mother of all bombs on ISIS. It is perhaps the largest non-nuclear weapon that has ever been used. It was used for the first time in combat in caves in Afghanistan. Dropped that today in Afghanistan, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So if you have not seen something about that, it just reminds us, Ron, that when we look at the Middle East, we really need to think a little bit about prophecy too, don't we?
Well, that's right. I mean, the Bible has an awful lot to say about the Middle East and prophecy, and Israel and its relationship to all of its surrounding neighbors. And one of the fascinating things to me personally is that we see all these alliances developing in the Middle East that seem perfectly compatible with what we read about in Ezekiel 36 through 39. And of course, we're talking about the Ezekiel invasion. And so it's my view that the Lord is shaping the Middle East for what's going to eventually be just a terrible outbreak of a war. And of course, the good news in all of that, and by the way, I always like to talk about good news when I talk about Bible prophecy. The good news is that the Lord will deliver Israel, despite the fact that Israel is overwhelmingly outnumbered by warriors. And so I'm keeping my eyeballs on the Middle East today. If you want to understand Bible prophecy, you got to watch out for the Middle East.
Yes, you certainly do. And I want to get into Ezekiel 38 and 39 in just a minute, but your book really helps us understand a lot more than that. And if nothing else, when we're talking about prophecy, we're talking about eschatology. It's one of the big words we use at seminary, but we're talking about the fact that unlike any other religious piece of literature, this is a book that has the fingerprints of God, because God knows the future, and we have so many Old Testament prophecies that have been fulfilled in history or in the life of Jesus Christ, and that gives us confidence that these prophecies we'll talk about today will be fulfilled in the future.
Well, that's right. The precedent has been set. When you look at the over 100 prophecies in the Old Testament, they were fulfilled quite literally when Christ came again. For example, Isaiah 7:14, Christ will be born of a virgin. We look at Micah 5:2, Christ will be born in Bethlehem. Zechariah 12:10, Christ will be pierced for our sins. From the line of Abraham, Genesis 12. From the line of David, 2 Samuel 7. I mean, I could just go on and on with this. But they were all fulfilled quite literally. And so that gives us confidence that the prophecies that deal with the second coming and all the events that lead up to it, including the tribulation period, will be fulfilled just as literally. And so that's the approach I use in this book. A principle I've always used that's kept me out of trouble is that when the plain sense makes good sense, seek no other sense lest you end up in nonsense.
In nonsense. Again, we are talking today with Dr. Ron Rhodes, and we'll open up the phones fairly early to give you a chance perhaps to ask some questions or make some comments. But let me come back to that, because in chapter 3, you talk about rightly interpreting prophecy. And I know some people, when they hear these programs, go, yes, well, I've heard all sorts of people making all sorts of claims. But again, one of the things you talk about is, first of all, a literal interpretation of the prophecies. Don't try to allegorize them. And then also a chronological one. One of the books I have up here on the table here from you was 40 Days Through Revelation. And if you look at the book of Revelation, you just say, okay, this happens, and then this happens, and this happens. There is a logic, there is a rationality that we can use to interpret prophecy, true?
Well, that's right. Even in the first part of the book of Revelation, we're given a little bit of an outline because the Lord tells John to write the things that you've just seen, write the things that presently are, and then write the things that will take place after this.
Yes.
Now, the things that John had just seen is chapter 1 in Revelation. That's the glorified Jesus.
Right.
And then the things that presently are, from John's perspective, dealt with the 7 churches of Revelation. Those are the 7 churches of Asia Minor. And it makes sense that John would be interested in those because he was kind of like the spiritual father of those 7 churches. And then when the text says, write the things that are after this, it's talking about, for example, the tribulation period in chapters 4 through 18, the second coming in chapter 19, the millennial kingdom in chapter 20, and then the eternal state in chapters 21 and 22. Now, to be fair, there are symbols in the book of Revelation, but typically those symbols are defined literally. For example, the Lord talks about 7 lampstands, and then he says those represent churches. The Lord talks about a bowl of incense, and then the Lord tells John that represents the prayers of the saints coming up before the Lord. And so even though symbols are used, they are defined so that we can make literal sense of the book of Revelation.
Now, there's one other thing I want to get to before we get into some of the prophecies, and you address this in the book as well. And we've dealt with this a little bit with other guests, but you certainly have done a great job of helping us understand the difference between Israel and the church, because there are some views by other Christians, and I appreciate the fact that they believe in the authority of the Bible, but somehow they tend to say that, all these promises that were given to Israel, the land, the regathering of the Jews to the nation of Israel and all that, many of these promises now, or all of these promises, go to the church. And so that's an important issue to address, because unless you do so, you're going to be making all sorts of mistakes in terms of your prophetic interpretation, true?
Well, that is true. And, like I said before, all the prophecies that talked about the first coming of Christ were fulfilled literally. In keeping with that, when you look at the Jewish covenants, and I'm talking about the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, and then it's repeated a number of times in Genesis, and then the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7, we see that those covenants are unconditional covenants. Now, a conditional covenant would say, okay, as long as Israel does such and so, then I will bless Israel.
Yes.
That would be a conditional covenant. But an unconditional covenant is a covenant that says, I, God, am going to bless you no matter what you do. This does not hinge upon your actions, but this is something I'm going to sovereignly do. So, for example, when God makes unconditional land promises to Israel in the Abrahamic covenant, those are going to literally come to pass, because God made an unconditional covenant.
Right.
Likewise, the throne promises in the Davidic covenant will literally come to pass because God said this does not depend upon you or what you do. This is what I'm going to promise to do because this is an unconditional covenant.
Well said. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we have Dr. Ron Rhodes in studio with us today. So first of all, you have a chance to watch the program as well as listen to it. He has his THM and his THD from Dallas Theological Seminary, a teacher there at a number of seminaries, including Dallas Seminary and Veritas Evangelical Seminary. We're going to focus a little bit on chapter 10 in the book because it talks about this Ezekiel invasion. And let me commend to you another book that I have quoted from constantly when I speak on this issue, and that is Northern Storm Rising, also by Ron Rhodes, as well as many of his others, The End Times in Chronological Order, Unmasking the Antichrist. Even if you want to learn a little bit about Islam, The 10 Things You Need to Know About Islam, there's all sorts of books, because there are 60 books out there, and probably millions of copies worldwide. So again, we are privileged, as always, to have Dr. Ron Rhodes in studio. But how does this relate, especially in Ezekiel? Because now we're starting to see alliances between Russia and Iran, and what about Libya, and what about Turkey? How does that fit into all of this? And so we're going to spend some time looking at that, and of course we'll give you a chance to join the conversation. 1-800-351-1212 if you have to ask questions about prophecy or about what is happening in the Middle East. We'll learn more about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and we'll cover all of those topics and take your phone calls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Let me ask you a question. What makes a society successful? You know, with all the talk this last year about trying to make America great again, the focus has been on individual political and economic policies. As important as those are, we need to step back and ask the bigger question about what makes for successful societies. Harvard historian Niall Ferguson has an answer to that fundamental question. His book, Civilization, the West and the Rest, puts so much in historical context. He says for 500 years, the West patented 6 killer applications that set it apart. The first to download them was Japan. Over the last century, one Asian country after another has downloaded these killer apps. Competition, modern science, the rule of law and private property rights, modern medicine, the consumer society, and the work ethic. Those 6 things are the secret sauce, he says, of Western civilization. Most of these ideas that Ferguson mentions arose in the West because of Christianity. In previous commentaries, I've talked about how a Judeo-Christian view gave rise to modern science, legal principles, and even the Protestant work ethic. If these were the killer apps that made for a successful society, then certainly a Christian foundation for society today would nourish and develop those even more effectively than any other cultural or religious foundation. And of course, here's the problem. Our secular society loves the fruits of Christianity, but it's also ready to cut down the tree that provided them. For example, we see attacks on Christianity, and we see attacks on religious liberty. Christian values gave rise to successful societies, so a return to biblical values is an important ingredient some trend watchers have been missing. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Ron Rhodes. Let me just mention that he is the president of Reasoning from Scriptures Ministries. If you go to our website, you will see that next to his picture it says See More, and you can go down to his website. And when you go there, it is, again, just an opportunity for you to learn a lot about his ministry, all sorts of articles, videos, and all the rest. And Ron, I've said this about you almost every time you've been in the program. I don't know anybody that works harder at answering every question you receive. And because you are so gracious, let's point out that sometimes you won't get a 24-hour turnaround because some of those questions are very detailed.
Well, that's true. I just got an email this morning that had a whole list of questions. I said, well, that's going to take a while.
That's going to take a while, but you are really gracious about that, so thank you.
Well, it's a ministry, you know, and then you're right. There's a bit of a delay only because so much email comes in.
Yeah.
But eventually we try to help everybody, you know, so.
Well, again, if you're worried about cults or world religions or religious movements or angels or demons or prophecy, all sorts of different aspects of apologetics, Ron Rhodes is certainly a person to contact, and we've made it very easy for you to get to know him a little better and to also find your way to Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries. Okay, Ezekiel 38, people open that up and they're going, okay, I don't understand this. We're talking about Magog and Meshech and Tubal and Cush and Put and Persia, and how do I make any sense out of this? This must have happened in the past.
Sounds like a foreign language, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does. And the first thing you talk about is that a lot of people will say, well, that happened in the past, but there's never been a time when those ancient nations worked together to fight Israel. So it's something in the future, but we have to translate those old names to new names, don't we?
Well, that's right. And actually, as you look at the context of Ezekiel, I mean, it does make good sense from a literal perspective, you know, as being for today. And the reason I say that is that, number one, this invasion cannot take place, according to Ezekiel, until Israel is reborn as a nation. That's the first thing that happens. Read Ezekiel 36 and 37.
Right. Okay.
You've got the Valley of the Dry Bones vision that Ezekiel has, with all these bones coming back together, and then flesh comes on the bones. That's kind of a metaphor that represents the rebirth of Israel. So, I mean, obviously, the rebirth of Israel is a pretty recent phenomenon. Now, the book of Ezekiel goes on to tell us that following Israel's rebirth, something incredible is going to happen. And that is Jewish people from all the nations of the world are going to migrate back to the Holy Land. That's never happened before. You know, back in Old Testament times, Israel might go into bondage to one nation, like Babylon, for example, and then they'll go back from Babylon back to the Holy Land after they've been released. You see, that's just one nation. But Ezekiel says that the Jews will be regathered from all the nations of the world, and that's what we're seeing today. And then, after that, the text says, now following those things, there's going to be an alliance of nations that develop that will launch a massive attack against Israel. And by, dusting off some of your old history books and your geography books, I mean, we can make some good sense of these various terms that are mentioned. For example, one of the nations is Persia. Now, we all know that Persia refers to modern Iran. That entire territory was actually called Persia up until 1935. Mm-hmm. The only difference between modern Iran and ancient Persia is that the borders were extended off to the east and the west. And so when we're talking about modern Iran, we need to keep in mind that Iran plus the east and the west of Iran will be part of this invading force. We also read about Turkey quite a bit, and that's significant because Turkey is in the news today regularly. Mm-hmm. And among the terms it refers to Turkey would be Meshach and Tubal. Also Beth Togarmah, also Gomer. You see, Turkey used to be divided into smaller territories. Today it's one big territory. In fact, it's pretty wide, east and west, if you look at it on a map.
Yes.
And so if you can imagine it being divided into smaller territories back in the old days, back in Old Testament times, that's what our text is dealing with here. And we also have reference to Russia. It's called Rosh in the text, and some people say, are you going to tell me that that's Russia just because it sounds like Russia? Rosh? Mm-hmm. And my response to that is no. For one thing, the biblical text tells us that it's to the uttermost north of Israel. And if you draw a line north of Israel, straight up, you go right through Moscow. Secondly, we have all kinds of artifacts and inscriptions in Assyria and elsewhere in Egypt that talk about Ras, Ras, Rus, or Rosh. All these are related terms, and they all refer to the territory that is now occupied by modern Russia. Now, I could go on and on. I spent a number of pages documenting all this, but the point that I'm making is that we have good evidence that Rosh refers to Russia. And then there's, Libya and Sudan and other Muslim nations around the Black and Caspian Seas.
Like Kush and Put and those
right,
things,
and you've got Afghanistan and Turkmenistan and all the Stan nations that are part of it. This is going to be a massive invasion, Kerby. Now, just think about it. If you look at a map of that part of the world and you look at Israel, it's kind of like a little slither.
Oh, yes.
Tiny. Just tiny.
Hard to see if you look at the entire Middle East.
It's hard to see. And then you look at all these giant Muslim nations, and you look at that and you say, well, Israel just doesn't have a chance. All these Muslim nations with the association with Russia are going to invade. Now, here's something to think about. A lot of people are surprised to hear that Russia's involved in this, but you got to keep in mind that precedent has already been set in Russia working with the Muslims against Israel. Back in the 1970s when you had, Syria and the Egyptians moving against Israel, guess who provided the weapons and the intelligence?
Yeah, Soviet Union.
It was the Soviet Union. That's exactly right. Mm-hmm. It's also interesting that, in the 1967 war, when there was a big battle taking place between Israel and some of the Muslim nations, Russia was set to invade, and they were actually steaming toward Israel with their fleet. And that's when the United States government got involved and said, back down, back down. So the United States was able to back down the Russian bear. But the point is that the Russians have already worked with the Muslims against Israel. And so it's no surprise that they're going to work together yet again when this Ezekiel invasion takes place.
And again, sometimes when I do PowerPoint presentations, I'll show a picture of Putin with a leader in Iraq or Iran or Libya or wherever it might be, or of course all the way back to Egypt, when you go to Gasser Abdel Nero, what was it? Anyway, the president of Egypt, you have all sorts of relations that have taken place between Russia and Egypt, Russia and Libya, Russia and Iran. So we've already seen all those taking place.
Well, that's right. In fact, Iran has a 25-year agreement with Russia for military buildup. And Iran is giving an absolute ton of money, oil money, I might mention, to Russia to pay for all of this. Now, at the same time, a lot of that oil money is also being segmented toward different terrorist organizations.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that's something that we're dealing with today as well. And to me, when I look at all these terrorist organizations out there that are being financed by oil, it's my opinion that, number one, the Lord is shaping the Middle East to what's going to be taking place during the tribulation period. But number two, I think it's making people cry out for a leader who can somehow solve the Middle East conflict, who can bring peace to the world, because it seems like our problems are global today, and we need global solutions. That's the argument.
Yes.
And so, actually, I think that's setting the stage for the coming Antichrist, who will one day sign a covenant with Israel and solve the Middle East conflict. Now, I must tell you that Daniel 9:27 tells that it's going to be a strong covenant. That seems to indicate that it's going to be a forced covenant backed up by strong military power. People will have no choice but to obey. And I think part of that covenant will stipulate that anybody that attacks Israel is essentially attacking the Antichrist, at least for the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period. Because we're also told in the prophetic text that at that midpoint of the tribulation period, the Antichrist will double-cross Israel, and he won't enforce that covenant any further. In fact, he'll become the big persecutor of the Jewish people at that time. But as I look at all this, the Middle East, the terror, the global problems that we have, it seems to me that we're witnessing what I call the convergence effect. All of these different prophecies are converging together at a point in the not-too-distant future. Now, I must be careful because I'm not a date setter and I'm not a sensationalist. But the Lord did seem to indicate that we can know the general season of his return. And so I look at it that way, that I think that we are in that general season now.
If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We're going to take a break. And again, there used to be some relation between Russia and Gamal Abdel Nasser. I just couldn't think of his name at the moment, in Egypt. But now look at the connections that actually exist between Putin and the various leaders, some who have been deposed, others that are coming to the fore. Just, again, all these things converging. So when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about a little bit of that Ezekiel invasion. But if you'd like to join our conversation, let's open up the phones, give you a chance to ask a question or make a comment. 1-800-351-1212. Privileged to have with us today Dr. Ron Rhodes, again, president of Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries. We have a link to his website. We'll do our best to try to answer your various prophecy questions, but that's why the Prophecy Answer book is so helpful. 250 pages. Again, we have information about it, so you can order it. But again, it's published by Harvest House. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore. If not, we can give you that opportunity to order it even online. Let's take a break. We'll start taking some of your phone calls at 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Ron Rhodes in studio with us today, teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary, the Veritas Evangelical Seminary, to mention just a few, author of 60 books, and talking about this newest book out. This, I think, is really going to be helpful because it's in a question-answer format. As I mentioned, published by Harvest House, 250 pages, Bible prophecy answer book, everything you need to know about end times, Revelation, Rapture, Armageddon, Israel. I focused a little bit of time on Ezekiel 38 simply because that seems to be kind of in the news right now, but I can see some of you want to talk about the rapture, some of you want to talk about the Abrahamic covenant, some of you want to talk about some of the signs, so all of those are fair game, and certainly if we don't get a chance to answer all of your questions, feel free to contact Ron Rhodes at Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries. We have that link on our website. So, Ron, let's put on our headphones and listen to our guests and callers. First of all, we'll go to Andrew in South Carolina. Thank you for calling today.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Always a pleasure to have a good meal while I'm driving home.
Well, we'd love to know what you would like to say or ask. Go for it.
Sure. So, Dr. Ron Rhodes, I believe you were on the Bible Answer Man a long time back.
Yes, in fact, I was on for 8 years, if you can remember that long ago. In fact, I often tell people with tongue-in-cheek it was back during the days of Moses.
Well, it was it started with Dr. Walter Martin, so I kept listening after his passing, and I just want to thank you for your teaching straight out of the Word of God. It's always a great thing to know that your opinions weren't based on your own, they were based on the truth of God's Word. So
Amen.
Thank you for that.
Amen to that. Well, Dr. Walter Martin was the one that actually hired me back then. And I just really loved him. I think that he did an awesome service to the body of Christ. And so his work continues in his publications.
Absolutely. So my question is, and I believe it's in Matthew, that Jesus had said to his disciples, when you see all the signs culminating, look up, your redemption draws near. And I believe, and I agree with you, that we are in that season. And I heard you talking about, obviously, the wars of coming out of Ezekiel and all the nations that are gathered around. With all of the other signs that we're seeing, the increase in earthquakes, violence, famines and pestilences and everything along those lines, and even aligning with the technology we have today, which they do, at least I read an article recently that said there are some groups in Europe that if you do not have a chip in your right hand, you can't even go to their groups and join them. Do you know anything about that? And do you believe that that's also leading into what we believe is the Antichrist out of Revelation 13, causing everybody to receive that mark?
Yeah, you're referring to the mark of the beast, and it's my opinion that the mark of the beast will be a visible sign on the hand or the forehead. The Greek word says on, not in. The Greek word indicates that whatever it is, it's on the skin. But the technology that you mentioned, I believe, is going to make it possible to enforce the mark of the beast. Now, it may be the mark of the beast is some kind of a tattoo. It may be that the popularity of tattoos today is actually setting the stage for the fact that one day tattoos will be required on the hand or on the forehead. And this will indicate allegiance to the Antichrist. And with today's technology, it's not going to be any problem whatsoever for everybody to have an account number and for every selling establishment to have an account number. And if you're not a registered supporter of the beast or the Antichrist, then you don't get to buy or sell. Now, the good news is that there are many, many believers in the Lord who will live during that time, and they will not take the mark of the beast. They may become martyrs, but they've got the crown of life waiting for them. They've got eternal life waiting for them. Now, by the way, in terms of those signs, I've categorized them personally into 6 categories. One is the rebirth of Israel sign. Then there's earth and sky signs. There's moral signs, religious signs, national alignment signs like the Ezekiel invasion nations, and then technological signs. And just for our listening audience, many of the signs mentioned in Scripture refer specifically to the tribulation period. However, today we see the stage being set for the fulfillment of many of those prophecies, indicating that the tribulation period is that much nearer. And in my opinion, if the tribulation is that much nearer, I believe the rapture is all the nearer. And so that's the way that I look at it. That's the way I talk about it in my books. And if you look at my books, you'll find that I provide scriptural references for every one of those ideas. Well,
you mentioned raptures. Let's go to Ann in Missouri, listening on KNEO. I think you had a question about the rapture. So, Ann, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for taking my call. And yes, Dr. Rhodes, I was wondering, true believers in the Lord, if they do not believe in the rapture, perhaps, or if they think there's going to be a post-tribulation rapture, will they be surprised?
They will be surprised, and you can explain it to them on the way up. I say that tongue in cheek, of course. There are good Christians who have different views on this today. And those Christians who have different views should not be thought to be unspiritual Christians or, not as biblical. All these positions are trying to be biblical. But here's the thing. If you're going to take a consistently literal approach in interpreting the prophecies, I believe you'll end up as a pre-trib, the idea that the rapture will happen before the tribulation period. To the extent that you interpret prophecies spiritually or allegorically, it's a lot easier to end up as a post-trib or even a mid-trib. And since the Old Testament prophecies were consistently, literally fulfilled in the coming of Christ, the first coming, I believe that the second coming references as well as the rapture references will be fulfilled literally as well. So, for example, when we are told in 1 Thessalonians 1, 9, and 10 that the church will be delivered from the wrath to come, I believe that's referring to the rapture of the church prior to the beginning of this time of wrath known as the tribulation. That's a literal interpretation.
Let's, if we can, since you are talking about tribulation and rapture, let's go to Gary in Arizona, KNLB. I think you wanted to ask a question related to that.
Yes, sir. You almost answered my question. I have for years believed in pre-trib rapture, but I've been listening to a lot of different theologians and speakers on the subject, and they kind of got me confused. This one gentleman, Ryan as his first name, says that he believes it's going to be a post-trib rapture, and I'm thinking, well, I kind of believed also that it was a mid-trib because there's going to be tremendous peace from, the Antichrist signing a peace agreement with Israel, and that's before his wrath is revealed. So that makes me kind of believe that it's a mid-trib thing. I was wondering what the doctor's views on that were.
Well, that's a great question. I believe that it's going to be a rapture before the tribulation period, and I say that for a number of reasons. First of all, not a single Old Testament passage on the tribulation mentions the church. Not a single New Testament passage on the tribulation mentions the church. In the book of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3, you find the church mentioned over and over and over and over again. And then when the tribulation begins in chapter 4, all the way through chapter 19, you don't see any reference to the church.
Yes.
It's not there. We're told in 1 Thessalonians 1, chapter 1, verses 9 and 10, easy for me to say, that, the church is to be delivered from the wrath to come, which I interpret to be the tribulation period. Now, the entire tribulation period is made up of God's wrath. That includes the seal judgments, which begin in the first half of the tribulation period. So God's wrath is even in the first half of the tribulation period. Now, here's something for you to think about. In 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 13 through 18, verses 13 through 17 actually talk about the rapture and being delivered from this time of wrath. But then in verse 18 it says, "Therefore comfort each other with these words." Now, if post-tribulationism were correct, I don't think that would make very much sense. It would amount to saying this to the Christian: you're going to go through 7 years of tribulation. You're going to go through the bowl judgments and the trumpet judgments and all the judgments of God, and you're going to experience God's wrath, and you're going to experience satanic wrath, and many of you are going to starve and become martyrs during that time. Therefore, comfort each other with these words. You see, that doesn't make good sense to me. The only way it makes sense for us to comfort one another with those words is if, in fact, the deliverance is going to take place prior to the beginning of the tribulation period. And so I've always argued this way. Having said that, like I said, there are some good Christians who hold to one of the other viewpoints. They are not less godly than pre-tribulationists. We're all in the family of God, but we've got a different approach to Scripture. I interpret these verses literally, and I think there's good reason for that.
I appreciate your spirit, because I've, as you well know, moderated a few of these debates over the years where there have been either pre-trib or mid-trib. One time I even moderated a debate between pre-trib and post-trib.
Oh, is that?
So there have been a couple, and we've even done a few of these on air. But again, these are all individuals that are born-again Christians, but we might disagree on this issue of eschatology.
Well, here's the thing. I've seen the word heretic used a number of times.
Not appropriate.
Where a post-trib will call a pre-trib a heretic, but to be fair, I've also heard of a pre-trib calling a post-trib a heretic. Here's the thing that brings us unity. We all agree on the big picture. We all agree that the Lord is coming again, that there's going to be a judgment, and there's going to be an eternal state, and that means for you and I that we're going to live forever in heaven. That's what brings us unity.
Let's take a break. We'll take some more phone calls right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. There is an effort in America to restrict chaplains in our military. Have you ever considered the enormous cost this could have on our armed forces? After the Battle of Bataan, Chaplain Robert P. Taylor joined some 75,000 soldiers in the Bataan Death March. Soldiers were indiscriminately shot, stabbed, and beheaded by their captors. Those who were not killed marched without food or water, driving men to drink from disease-ridden puddles. As they marched, Chaplain Taylor knew his task was to provide spiritual guidance that would increase morale, perhaps making the difference between life and death. Once the survivors of the death march made it to a prisoner of war camp, Taylor continued his spiritual leadership. Not only did he lead daily religious services and encourage his men to remember the God who gave them strength, he found a way to smuggle much-needed food into the camp. For that, he was rewarded with 14 weeks of debilitating torture that put him in a coma. Taylor spent 42 months in captivity. He never stopped providing spiritual care for his soldiers, something he continued in peacetime as the Air Force Chief of Chaplains. His spiritual care saved many, many lives. Some think their cause is righteous when suing the military in hopes of ending a chaplain's career. But what if that chaplain is the next Robert Taylor? To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have in studio with us for just a few more minutes, Dr. Ron Rhodes, author of the book Bible Prophecy Answer Book, everything you need to know about the end times, about 250 pages, published by Harvest House. Probably you can find it in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to order it and also to find your way to Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries. He is the president. And we earlier talked a little bit about Ezekiel 38, and also we do see some of those references in the book of Revelation. So let me go to Zoma in Georgia, listening on the Good News Network. Thank you for calling today. You're on with Ron Rhodes.
Hello, I love your program. Very helpful. My question is about if he thinks that Gog and Magog from Ezekiel 38 is the same one as the one in Revelation 20, because to me it looks like there are two different Gog and Magog wars. So that's it.
That is a great question, and I think that they are different wars because they're portrayed as being distinct in Scripture. You might keep in mind that in the Ezekiel invasion, which takes place before the tribulation period or at the very beginning of it, there's a coalition of localized nations, including Russia and Muslim nations, that invade from the north. But in the invasion at the end of the millennial kingdom, there is an international army from the four quarters of the earth. That's what Revelation 20, verse 8 says. Now, the invasion mentioned in Revelation 20, verse 9 is up on the broad plain and against the camp of the saints. Those are the words that describe it. By contrast, the Ezekiel invasion before the tribulation period is on the mountains of Israel. The invasion prophesied by Ezekiel occurs relatively soon after Israel's rebirth and the ingathering of Jewish people from around the world. But the invasion in Revelation 20 occurs after Jesus has been reigning on the earth for 1,000 years. So my conclusion is that the reference in the book of Revelation is kind of a shorthand metaphor. You know, it's kind of like in Bible times, if you use the term Corinthian, that wouldn't be a positive description of somebody. Like if I was to call Kerby a Corinthian, that would be bad.
Yeah.
Or if I called them a Nazarene, that wouldn't be good either, because Nazarene or Nazareth had a bad reputation back in Bible days. So I think that the term Magog and Gog in Revelation is kind of a shorthand term indicating that it's going to kind of be like a Gog and Magog war in as much as many, many people invade God's people. It's as simple as that.
Makes sense. Let me take one more. We also started out by talking about the Abrahamic covenant, so I wanted to go to Robert in Texas, KAVX. So, Robert, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Yes, my question is, the Abrahamic covenant clearly outlines the lands that Israel is set to inherit. Well, Israel has never inherited all that land. They've never inhabited all that land. So how do you feel that will factor into biblical prophecy?
Well, that's a great question. I believe that the fulfillment, the ultimate fulfillment of not just the Abrahamic covenant, but also the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7, will not take place until the millennial kingdom, which Christ will set up after the second coming. Now, the good news for Israel is that the Jewish remnant will become saved. You might remember in Romans 9 through 11, the Apostle Paul affirmed that God was not through with Israel yet. And when you read Zechariah 12 and 14, along with the verses in the book of Revelation, it's very clear that it's in the context of Armageddon, when the forces of the Antichrist are moving against the Jewish remnant, that Israel finally recognizes that Jesus indeed is the divine Messiah, and they cry out to the Lord for deliverance. Now, most people do not think of the second coming as a rescue mission, but from the Jewish perspective, it will be a rescue mission, because when the redeemed Jewish remnant, who's just become born again, cries out to the Lord for deliverance as the Antichrist is moving upon them, Christ comes again, and with the power of his tongue, he slays them. And then it's immediately following that Christ will set up his millennial kingdom, and he will invite that Jewish redeemed remnant into his kingdom, and it's at that time that the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant and the Davidic covenant will find full fulfillment. Not partial fulfillment, but absolutely full fulfillment.
Just before we end, let's talk about, again, some of the positive aspects of prophecy, because, again, sometimes if you go to a prophecy conference, you come home and you don't even want to buy green bananas because you're convinced the rapture is going to happen before the day's out. And yet there is a sense in which we are to be salt and light. We are to be in the world, but not of the world. We should be occupying, not preoccupied with his coming. But at the same time, prophecy reminds us that the time is short. And I think, if nothing else, this really stimulates our evangelistic zeal, don't you think?
Oh, I think so. And I think as a beginning point, Bible prophecy helps us to see that the Bible really is the Word of God.
Yes.
Now, I know I've told you before that when I became a believer, I was in Hollywood, of all places.
Yes, I remember that.
And
you were on television all the time.
Well, I was doing a lot of the big network shows out there, like The Tonight Show and Merv Griffin and Mike Douglas show. And a lot of people are saying, I never heard of those shows. Yeah, that was way back in the day.
I remember. Yeah.
And, the point is that the thing that got my attention was Bible prophecy. And for the first time, I came to believe that the Bible really must be the Word of God, because only God can know the future. Psychics may pretend to know the future, but they get it wrong.
Yes.
Only God knows the future. And so that's the first thing. It helps us to understand that the Bible is the Word of God. But secondly, it is a great evangelistic tool, and that was true in my own life. I became a believer directly as a result of Bible prophecy. I grew up in a liberal church, but now that I understood prophecy, I was on track. But beyond that, I think that it really provides a motivation for believers not only to share the good news of the gospel, but to make a difference in the world, salt and light, as it were. And, in Colossians 3, verses 1 and 2, we are told to keep our eyes focused on future things, keep our eyes focused on the things of heaven. And there's two things about that passage of Scripture. It's an imperative, and an imperative means it's a command. And then, secondly, it's a present tense. That means continuous action.
Right.
Every day that we live, we are to let our actions and our attitudes to be governed by our future hope. And that future hope includes the fact that Christ could come for us at any moment in the rapture. And if that doesn't change your behavior, then you need to contact me immediately at my website, ronrhodes.org, and I'll help you get a correct perspective on that.
Yeah. Again, you can go to Ron Rhodes, or of course we have a link there to Ron Rhodes, as well as Reasoning from the Scriptures Ministries. And again, as I've said so many times before, you're very good about answering those email questions that you receive. So again, thank you so very much for being with us, especially during this Resurrection Week. Just a great opportunity, just a week after some of those Tomahawk missiles landed in Syria, to talk about what's happening in prophecy. So thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you. It's always a pleasure.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, Gary Chapman's going to be with us. But just before we do so, you might remember that we have been really challenging some of you to join with us on our truth team. And that is, we're really involved in rebuilding truth in a post-truth culture. And you can do this by a number of ways. You can, first of all, go to the website, pointofview.net, and we have a banner there that says, join the truth team, rebuilding truth in a post-truth culture. And we would hope that if you would maybe say, I appreciate the kind of conversation that you're having even today about Bible prophecy, bringing experts on the program. Maybe you could send a one-time gift. But we also are looking for those of you that might want to join with us for the truth team. And for as little as $1 a day, $30 a month, $360 a year, you can be part of that truth team. And so let me encourage you to consider doing that. Also, even though we're going off the air for this first hour, and then we'll be back on the air right afterwards, we still also take phone calls on the pledge line number. Now, I haven't given that out too much in the last day or two, so let me mention that. 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. And you could talk to someone and find out a little bit more about how you can support this ministry, because we do believe that all these topics we address are important. And as we have spent some time talking about prophecy, in the next hour we're going to talk about things I wish I'd known before we became parents. Gary Chapman will be with us. Looking forward to that interview. And so again, we encourage you to visit the website, find out more about Ron Rhodes, Gary Chapman, but also take the time to consider what you might do to join the Truth Team. We'll be back right after this.
And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, here on Point of View, we talk about family and parenting, and we're going to be focusing on that this hour, especially during this Resurrection Week. I just thought it would be a time to get away from some of the heavy topics we've been addressing and to also encourage you and equip those of you that are parents or grandparents with some very interesting material that we're going to be covering. The title of the book, Things I Wish I'd Known Before We Became Parents. Oh, my goodness, this is going to be a great selling book and one that you certainly want to hand to anyone that is raising kids or about ready to expect a child to come onto the scene. It is written by our good friend, Dr. Gary Chapman, author, speaker, counselor, probably best known for the 5 Love Languages series that he has done. We've talked about many of those with him, and he's the director of marriage and family life consultants and also has a radio program, but every once in a while joins with us here on Point of View. So Dr. Gary Chapman, always great to have you on the program.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's good to be with you again.
One of the things I love about your writing is you certainly teach us a great deal, but we always have a smile on our face as we go through this. And here you have 12 different things that you wish you had known, you and your wife had known before you became parents. And anybody that is a parent or a grandparent can look back and say, yeah, I wish I'd known those too. This is why I think this book's going to be so much fun to hand to couples that are expecting their first child, but also put it in the hands of individuals that are raising their children right now and maybe need a little bit of 10,000-mile wheel alignment or something like that.
You know, the reality, Kerby, is most of us have very little knowledge of how to raise children. You know, it's much easier to have a baby than it is to raise a baby.
It is. And again, it's fun to think about various things you wish you had known. So I thought we would work through the 12 if you don't mind, and certainly sure. Along the way there's some just great illustrations. But let me just mention before some of our listeners might say, well, I don't have a kid, so I'm not interested. I would say, first of all, if you're a pastor, I would highly recommend that you think about maybe even doing a sermon series on these. Maybe you could make it 4 weeks. You take each one of maybe 3 each week. It would take you a while to go through that. If you're a Sunday school teacher, even if you aren't necessarily raising your own kids, you know individuals that are. And for all of us, we are aware of couples that when they're going to have a baby, we think, okay, what could we buy them? And I think this is one that I'd put in a basket with a number of other goodies, things I wish I'd known before we became parents. It's just a great opportunity to encourage individuals. And as you said, these kids don't come with a user's manual. And so as a result, they're just all sorts of things you sort of learn by doing. And oftentimes, I would have to say, Dr. Gary Chapman, we learn by the mistakes we made in the past.
Well, you are exactly right, Kerby. A lot of things I learned the hard way. And I wrote this book, of course, with Dr. Shannon Warden, who still has 3 children at home. She's a professor at Wake Forest University, which is local here in our city, and we've been friends for a long time. So we're just trying to give really practical help to those who have just had the first baby or maybe the second baby, because one of the chapters is, I wish I'd known that no 2 children are alike. So don't put them into a mold, you know. So we're excited about it. We think this book's going to help a lot of parents.
This, again, is published by Moody, but, of course, they have a special imprint called Northfield Publishing. 200 pages. Probably can find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link to Dr. Gary Chapman, so you can get it there. We also have information about this book on the website. And a little bit later, we're going to talk about his website because, again, 5 love languages, and there's 5 love languages for men, 5 love languages for children, growing up social, and many others. But let's get into at least 1 or 2 topics before we take our first break, and that is one thing I wish I'd known, that having children radically changes your schedule. You think? I mean, certainly it does. But share some of the principles that you and Shannon were able to develop in that particular chapter.
Well, you know, my wife and I, when she agreed, and she really wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, so I thought, well, this is not going to affect me very much. You know, she's going to be at home all day. She'll take care of the baby. I don't have to worry about that, you know. Wow, was I in for a rare surprise. It takes 2 people to raise a baby. You know, I am very empathetic with single moms. I'm telling you, they have a terrific job. But the design, the ideal is there's a mom and a dad there to work with all these details. You know, the issues you have to face is the whole issue of breastfeeding or not breastfeeding. You know, we thought a little bit about that beforehand, but that's just, the question has to be decided pretty soon. And I suggest you talk to your mother,
yes.
your sister, and all others who've gone that route. And, of course, your doctor. And then the whole thing of changing diapers, you know, you got to you put the food in, you take the food out, you know, and then the baby's sleeping, you know, how long are they supposed to sleep?
Yeah.
I mean, don't babies sleep all night? You know, well, we pray, but that doesn't happen just automatically, you know. So I think there's an awful lot to be learned in those early stages. One of the things is to get organized. You know, use the talents, the best talents of each parent. And we all have, you know, pros and cons in terms of our strengths and weaknesses. And be creative, you know. As the children get a little older, you know, you enter into all kind of games with them, tea parties and pirates and coloring books and all that kind of stuff. The other thing I'd suggest is involve other people. Let your family help you if they are around. Now, I know that sometimes we're 2,000 miles away from our parents, but if family's there, especially your parents, I mean, they'd love to help you. And so allow them to help you. And then I would say simplify. Think about what activities in our life maybe need to be eliminated. You can't continue to do everything you were doing before the baby came. I mean, you didn't have a baby then. So you may have to drop off a golf game here or there. Ooh, or maybe spend less time on the computer.
Yes.
Less time, you know. So we have to recognize we have limitations. And when a baby arrives, it means we have got to give attention to the baby, and it's a 24/7 job, and especially in those early years and early months. And so a lot of things we can do, but we have to see it as a team effort and not simply leaving it to one parent to care for the child.
Again, things I wish I'd known before we became parents, and this one, that having children radically changes your schedule. And I might mention in each chapter you have this, of course, section on making it work, where you talked about getting organized, get creative, involve others, simplify, and even celebrate what's working. But then at the end of every chapter, again, I think this is such a great book, you and Shannon have put together like a half a dozen questions under a category called Talking It Over. And so this would be something that would help couples that are going through this to really think through some of the decisions that they've made already or the decisions they are about to make. So again, some great material. We've covered one of the 12, and we'll do our best to try to cover most of them, but the book is available to you, as I've said before, in probably a lot of Christian bookstores, simply because so popular is Dr. Gary Chapman that I'm sure there will be carrying it. But if you have any difficulty at all finding it, don't hesitate to go to our website, pointofview.net. First of all, we have a link to his website, 5lovelanguages.com, and you can find some of the material there. We also have information about the book as well, and so all of that available to you at the website, pointofview.net. When we come back, we'll talk about a couple of the other things that Gary and Shannon said we wish we had known. That children are expensive, that no two children are alike, that potty training is no laughing matter, that children need boundaries, and many, many more. We're going to get into all of those, and let's take a break and continue our conversation after the break with Dr. Gary Chapman. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Pleased to have with us today Dr. Gary Chapman, and talking about his new book, Things I Wish I'd Known Before We Became Parents. We'll keep it moving because there's so many things to cover, and certainly the second one would not be a surprise to too many parents. The first thing I wished I'd known is that children can radically change your schedule, but number two, that children are expensive. Yes, they are, and you found that out. You and Sharon did some research, and boy, they can be expensive, can't they?
I had no idea, Kerby, really, that children would be that expensive. You know, the research we found is from birth to the age of 17. Now, this has nothing to do with paying for college. It costs $250,000 to raise a child.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that.
Wow. Now, that's based on a middle income, two-child, husband-wife family, you know. That's $14,705 a year. Well, it may not be, you know, yours may not be that much, or it may be more. But we do have to realize that we cannot spend money the way we have spent money beforehand. We've got to take care of the child. The child's needs are going to have to take precedent over some other things. So, you know, we talk about the self-discipline, you know, committing yourself to self-discipline. Have a budget and then stick with the budget. Otherwise, you can get in debt very, very quickly. caring for the child, and trying to do everything you've always done. And then we talk about creativity, how to stretch dollars, the whole thing of coupons, and then pass down clothes. Your cousin probably has some clothes that are really good. You don't have to go out and buy new clothes, and their friends that would be glad to share the clothes with you, and the toys as well. So, utilize the efforts of other people around you. Some people feel like, well, I want my child to have brand new clothes and da-da-da. Well, by the time you have 5 children, you're passing down the clothes, okay? So take advantage of others. And then another thing is to utilize the free things in life with your children as they get older. City parks, libraries, walking trails, those things don't cost a thing, and they're in most cities. Even most small towns have those things. So utilize those things. And we also talk about in this chapter not just money, but the expense in terms of energy and time, because the child is going to take time, the child is going to take energy. The question is whose energy and whose time. And it's certainly important to spend time with children, no question about that. Another thing we talk about also is having a special bedtime for children, because you've got to conserve your own energy. And so if you let the kid just stay up all hours, late hours, when are you going to recuperate? We did pick up on this one pretty early in our marriage with our children. We started putting them to bed at 7 o'clock. And we did that until they were 6 years old, 7 o'clock every night. Now, in the early stages, of course, they're up and down all night. But, as they develop. And then we would raise, at 6 years of age, we raised it 5 minutes. So they got to stay till 7:05, But by the time they're 12, they're still going to bed at 7:35, and you have time after that to talk with each other and recuperate.
It's just crazy.
But again, I'm in Walmart at 10:30, on a Friday and our Thursday night, 10:30, and here's a little 3-year-old in Walmart.
I know.
What's this kid doing here?
And again, and we're going to get to that in just a minute in terms of boundaries and everything. But in this chapter, you also raise a question that you and I didn't have to deal with as much, but the modern parents do, and that is technology. How do I get them off the screens? And you say, well, the answer is simple. You control the technology. And so that's another part of managing your time and energy, isn't it?
It is indeed. And we have to also manage our time on the screen. So many parents, they spend all their free time on the screen. And then they allow their children to do that. And so for the children, it's like, well, they're content. They're quiet now. Just let them have the screen. If they stay on the screen all those childhood years, they're going to do it in the teenage years. And then they're going to do it when they get married. It's not going to bode well for marriage. So we've got to control technology. You mentioned earlier I wrote an entire book on that topic, Growing Up Social, raising relational kids in a screen-driven world. So how do we control? There ought to be screen-free places in the house, and there ought to be time limits on the use of screens, both for adults and for children, because we've got to set the pace for them. Yeah, it's an important area.
Again, I might just, again, mention that book. It is really one that if you are living in this 21st century technology, you and Arlene have written this excellent book, Growing Up Social, and I, of course, interviewed both of you on the book and other books as well. But let's keep it going. One that I, again, probably think most people might understand. Another thing you wish you had known is no two children are alike. I have sometimes seen, Dr. Gary Chapman, some families where the kids come out as cookie cutters. They're just clones of each other. So if one has piano lessons, all of them have piano lessons. If one plays soccer, they all play soccer. But in most families, the kids are so different that you sometimes look at them and say, did these come from the same mother? Did these come from the same father? What about that?
Well, that's very, very true. Comparing your children with other children can be discouraging, or it can give you pride, your child is better than other people. And we tend to do this a lot in our culture. Even when they're born, we say, oh, the baby was 21 inches, weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces. And we say, oh, well, my baby was just, even on little things like that, we're comparing them. But the fact is, children are very different. When our daughter came along, she was first, and we realized that she could almost have raised herself. She was so compliant, she followed rules and all that. And then we had a son, and he was radically different. So we experienced that firsthand. But, you know, we tend as parents to look at the child and think, oh, they're too skinny or they're too fat, you know, or they're too careful about what they eat. They won't eat turnips or whatever. Another thing that young parents, first-time parents, are often surprised and they get concerned. It's very common for a child to lose 5 or 10% of their birth weight the first few days after you bring them home. And some parents panic when they say, oh, the child's weighing less than they did when they were born. What's wrong? Well, that's a very common thing for children. The amount of sleep that children get is very different, and you have to identify the sleep patterns. Often within 6 months, they can sleep through the night. Others, it might be 9 months before they do that. Physical health is very, very different. Some children have allergies, have more viruses and colds and earaches than other children do. Personality, as they get a little older, the personality develops, and some are very strong-willed, and others are easygoing. And, you know, that was our daughter was easygoing, our son was strong-willed. Mm-hmm. The activity level of children,
yes,
you know, is very, very different, and the intensity of reaction to things is very different. So just a lot of differences between children. So don't expect, if you have 2 children, don't expect them to be alike. If you have 4, don't expect them to be alike. And as you said earlier, some parents, I think, do try to put them into a cookie-cutter mold, and I don't think that's healthy because God made us unique, and we want to develop that child's uniqueness.
Very good. Well, you know, in 45 years on Point of View, there's probably very few topics we've ever addressed, except for this one, Chapter 4. One of the things I wish I'd known, that potty training is no laughing matter. I think we're breaking new ground. I don't think we've ever talked about that on Point of View, but we will right now. So what would you want to share about that?
It's time to do it. It's time to do it, Kirby. And to be honest, I never gave much thought to this either. You know, I just thought, you know, they use the diaper for a little while and then they go to the potty, you know. But I remember after a month or so, I said to my wife, how long do we have to change diapers? I mean, when does the potty training start? And we do deal with that in the book. The most common mistake that parents make is starting potty training too early.
Yes.
And when you do that, it just stretches out the time. They don't learn faster. It just takes longer to get them to the place where they're using the potty. And how do you know when to begin? That's a common question we're often asked. There's several little clues that you can pick up on. When they bring attention to the dirty diaper, that is, they come to you and they're pointing to their diaper, means that there's a possibility it's time to start them on potty training. Or when they express interest in using the toilet, you know, they might ask if they can do that. Or when you wake them up after a long morning nap or a long afternoon nap and the diaper's still dry, that's another clue that maybe they're ready for potty training. But the other question is, are you ready? Because this can be taxing for the parent. And we say, don't start the potty training if you've just moved to a new house or a new apartment or just taken a new job.
Right.
I mean, you need to be emotionally stable when you're getting ready to go into this task.
Predictability. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation today. Just privileged to have with us today Dr. Gary Chapman. Again, you're familiar with many of his books, including the 5 Love Language series. We have information about that on our website, pointofview.net. This is just a delightful book, very well written. Things I Wish I'd Known Before We Became Parents. And again, it is published by Northfield, which is the publishing imprint of Moody. And so you can probably find it very easily on both online, but also in your bookstore. But let's take a break. We will continue our conversation with Dr. Gary Chapman right after this.
The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Gary Chapman. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. This may be one of those programs where you just want to sit back and listen as we talk about things I wish I'd known before we became parents. And I wanted to continue on. And Gary, first of all, there is a very good chapter here on something you wish you had known, and that is children need boundaries. Now, we've sort of addressed a little bit of that, of having a consistent bedtime for teenagers, a consistent curfew. So in some respects, some parents already have rules and regulations and boundaries. But can you, for just a minute, talk about why boundaries are so important to our children?
Well, they're extremely important, Kerby, and particularly in the first 10 years. I'm telling you, the teenage years will be much easier if you establish boundaries the first 10 years. The child realizes there's some things we do and there's some things we don't do. You give them total freedom the first 10 years, and it'll be chaos when they're teenagers. So this is really, really important. Now, one of the things we emphasize is that we ought to have good rules. They ought to be intentional. They ought to serve a purpose. Such purpose as they keep the child from danger. Does this rule teach the child a positive character trait? Or does it protect property? Or are we teaching them responsibility? Or are we teaching them good manners? I mean, they ought to be reasonable, and they ought to be intentional. Early on in our raising our children, we had a rule that we don't sing at the table. And one night my wife said to me, "Honey, why do we have this rule?" I said, "Well, my mother and daddy, that's what we had." And she said, "Well, so did my parents." But, my wife's a musician, okay? She said, they come to the children, they come to the table, they're singing their songs. We say, "Oh, no, you can't sing at the table."
Where did that come from?
She said, "It should be a happy time, I'm not talking about singing with food in your mouth, but I'm talking about singing as you sit down or singing after you finished eating. So we changed that rule, just trying to be realistic. And also the husband and the wife should make the rules, not one of us, but together we ought to agree on the rules. And we ought to have consequences. If you break the rules, here's what happens. Otherwise, they break the rule, and you respond depending on your own emotional state. If you're stressed out, you might over-respond to the child's misbehavior. So if you set the consequences beforehand, let everybody know what the consequences are, then all you have to do is just kindly and firmly administer the consequences. And the child learns there are consequences if we break the rules. And if we live within the rules, everything's happy and we're doing fine. So, that whole chapter is a very important chapter.
Very important, yeah.
Learning how to set boundaries and then how to give the discipline.
And again, at the end of each chapter, there's a talking it over, and this is one where you really do want parents to talk it over so that you come to the same agreement about rules and what are going to be the non-negotiables. But let me keep moving, because another one of those things you wish you'd known is that children's emotional health is as important as physical health. You can pick up all sorts of books, Dr. Gary Chapman, which talk about making sure that your children are healthy and how to take care of them and make sure they get their vaccinations, make sure that they eat right and all the rest. But sometimes we forget about the emotional component, and that is also key.
Well, it is, and if we don't meet the emotional need and teach them, how to respond to their own emotions, they're going to be crippled when they get to be adults. It all begins in the very early stages when the child is born. That's what the psychologists call attachment, emotional attachment. And this comes by holding the baby, cuddling the baby, kissing the baby, talking to the baby, singing to the baby, just spending time with the baby, undivided attention with the baby, so that the baby connects with you emotionally, both the father and the mother. And then we talk about the stages of emotional development, building trust in the child, that the child can trust you, so that, if you say to them, come to daddy, or, you got them up on a little ledge and you say, jump, I'll catch you. Well, you catch them. You don't back off, or they lose trust in you. So teaching them how to trust, teaching them autonomy. And this, ages 1 to 3, 1 to 1.5 or so, they're exploring, and we want them to explore. We want them to realize they can walk into the other room and do things. Yeah, they're going to make a mess now and then, but we want them to build autonomy and initiative. We want them to engage in playing with other children, and then competence. And this is really important between the ages of 5 and 12. We want them to have the sense that they can accomplish things. This is where affirming their efforts is important, rather than affirming perfection. We don't wait till they do something perfect before we affirm them. We affirm their efforts. You did a good job. You really worked hard on this project, Then later you can tell them how to do it better, the next time. But meeting the need for emotional love is also key. And that, of course, is what we deal with in the 5 love languages, is that every child has a primary love language. You want to give heavy doses of the primary, sprinkle in the other 4, so the child knows how to receive love and give love in all 5 languages. That's the healthiest adult.
Again, just great material that's in this book, Things I Wish I'd Known Before We Became Parents. Dr. Gary Chapman with us, co-author with Shannon Warden. And let's talk about a couple of others, that children are greatly influenced by our model. Even yesterday, I was talking about how Joe Aldridge at Multnomah School of the Bible referred to kids as values vacuum cleaners. They just suck up the values, and in some respects, it is really important for us to set a good model before our children, isn't it?
It really, really is. You know, the most sobering question I've ever asked myself, what if my children turn out to be like me? Mm-hmm. So in the book, we challenge parents to go through a little list of questions. You know, what if my child grows up to handle anger the way I handle anger? To treat their spouse the way I treat my spouse? To drive a car the way I drive a car? And we go on down the list. Just helping parents realize the model they are setting for their children is far more powerful than their words. And that's why when we fail to live up to our own standards, we need to apologize to the child, because the child loses trust in us if we tell them, you know, this is what you do, and then we don't do it. So you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be perfect, but you do have to deal with your failures.
And again, you talk about that in Chapter 8. Parents need to apologize. You know, there was a model that was not so long ago that maybe isn't so much the baby boomer model or certainly now the millennial model, but it was the older one that just said, look, I got to be strong for my children, and if I make a mistake, well, we're just going to keep going. They're just going to have to tough it up. And I never apologize to my kids. But you're a counselor and even a student of cultural anthropology, which I learned by reading this book, and you recognize how important it is for parents to actually apologize to their kids if they've made a mistake.
Absolutely. Where's the child going to learn to apologize if you don't apologize?
Good point.
They know when you make a mistake. You know, when you lose your temper and yell at a child, deep inside that child, they know that's not right. That's not good. That's not kind. And you've taught them to be kind. So we can make failures, to be sure, but we have to apologize for our failures. And the children are free to forgive us. And we're teaching them how to apologize when they do wrong, because they're going to do wrong, and they're going to need to be forgiven as well.
So again, we need to continue, but one of the other ones you talk about is that social skills are as important as academic skills. Again, you know, there's been a lot of emphasis, Dr. Gary Chapman, over the years on intellectual growth and intellectual importance and improvement and those kinds of things. But we're recognizing that emotional intelligence is very important as well. And so this is empathy, it's teaching kindness. Talk a little bit about what we need to do there.
Well, I think teaching children social skills is extremely important. Now, nothing wrong with academics. I mean, we talk about that as well. The child needs to learn. They need to be a learner. But they also need to learn how to relate to people. You know, we all know people who are brilliant, but they go from job to job to job because they can't get along with people. Mm-hmm. You know, they don't have social skills. So in this chapter, we're talking about how to develop social skills. And you mentioned empathy. It's the ability to feel someone else's pain. And this begins by identifying with the child's pain. You know, it sounds like, honey, that you're feeling disappointed. Is that right? And the child learns to say, I'm feeling disappointed. You know, you are identifying their emotion. You're giving a name to it, and you're empathizing with them. And then teaching kindness, words and deeds that enhance the lives of other people. We're called to be kind. We want our children to be kind. So it begins by speaking kindly to your own child and doing kind things for the child, and then helping the child do kind things for their grandmother, their grandfather, or their little boy next door. So we're teaching them kindness. And then the whole art of saying thank you. Oh, gratitude is so important as a social skill. We give little games to play. For example, a Thanksgiving game. Everybody in the family gets in a room, and you take turns giving thanks for something in the room. You know, I'm thankful for this chair. And somebody says, I'm thankful for the blinds. I'm thankful for the lamp. I'm thankful for the bed. I'm thankful. It's just teaching the child and teaching us to be thankful for the things that surround us every day.
Part of the book, Things I Wish I'd Known Before We Became Parents. Dr. Gary Chapman with us. We'll continue our conversation with him right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Dr. Gary Chapman for just a few more minutes, co-author with Shannon Warden of the book, Things I Wish I'd Known Before We Became Parents. And I wanted to come to this issue of education. I wish I'd known that parents are responsible for their child's education. I know you've, of course, very focused on the area of education. You finished your master's degree in education even before you had your first child. But help us, if we can, for just a few minutes, Gary, think through this issue, because it is not only the issue of where I put my kids in school, but how, as a parent, I oversee the education of my children. How do we think through all those very important questions?
Well, it is a huge area of concern for parents. And I would remind parents that a lot of education takes place before they go to the first grade. They're home with you, you know.
Yes.
And, of course, you have decisions to make about preschool children. Is one parent going to stay at home, be a stay-at-home mom or dad? Is the extended family going to help? You know, is my mother going to take care of the child while I work? Are we going to put them in a preschool? So there are a lot of educational questions before we get to the first grade. And then, of course, we get to the first grade, and there's all kind of choices. There's a traditional public school. And, you know, public schools are good in certain places in this country. Other places, they're terrible. Yeah, there's charter schools where parents have more involvement. There's magnet schools where they're still public schools, but they're on a focused theme, such as science or math. And then there's private schools. And 80% of these schools are religiously affiliated. And 5.3 million students are in private schools. And then there's homeschooling. 2 million students are in homeschooling. So there's a lot of options. And what you want to do is look at the curriculum that's being taught, because it guides what the child learns. What is the philosophy behind the curriculum? I think this is why so many Christians have opted for either private schools or homeschools. It's because so many of the public schools, the philosophy behind the curriculum really is not consistent with Christian truth. So we need to be sure where we have our children, but then while they're going to school, wherever they're going to school, we need to be talking about what they're learning and making sure that what they're learning is in keeping with truth, first of all, and in keeping with our own Christian values.
Last two real quickly, and one of those is, I wish I'd known that marriages do not thrive on autopilot. And this, as a counselor, you run into so often, and that is individuals come in and say, I feel like our marriage isn't working anymore because she or he or whatever is spending all the time with the baby, and I am getting no attention whatsoever. Or he now is off with the boys, but there's nothing in our marriage. Or she's with the girls, and they're always off doing various girl activities, but we're never involved as a couple. And that's a real important issue to pay attention to, especially as you have more than one child, and especially as they begin to really, because of their needs, dominate and take over the time that you used to spend working on your marriage.
And it's a grave danger. I remember the man who said to me, Dr. Chapman, I lost my wife. I said, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. He said, I don't mean she died. I mean, she spends all of her time with the baby, you know. So we have to give attention to our marriage. The kids are with us for 18 years in our culture, you know, and we're going to still be there after that, we hope. And so we've got to keep our marriage growing. So we talk about, you know, really resolving. We are going to keep our marriage alive. We're going to find a way to spend time with each other, to do things together, to encourage each other. We're going to learn how to listen and share our ideas and our feelings with each other rather than preaching to each other. And we're going to speak each other's love language. We're going to learn how to resolve our conflicts. And we're going to learn how to apologize and forgive. And we're going to keep working on our marriage. We're going to make it happen. If you're not intentional, it won't happen. If you just drift, you will drift apart. We never drift together. So in this chapter, we're trying to really challenge the mom and the dad to realize that the marriage is the most fundamental relationship in the family. And you give your children the picture of a mom and dad who love and support and care for each other. You're doing them a tremendous service, and you're creating great security in the hearts of your children because they see the way you love and care for each other.
And the final one that you talk about is, again, I wish I'd known that children can bring you great joy. Nothing else, it's just, again, a reminder of the fact that children are a blessing from the Lord. They're arrows in our quiver, and they are something that we should rejoice, and especially in the Christian world, we should encourage other families to enjoy their children and not be so caught up in the day-to-day activities that they miss those fun opportunities to get to see your children grow up.
Well, absolutely. I think no question about it, children bring great joy. In 3 John verse 4, John said, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Now, he was talking about his spiritual children, okay? But it's true for us. As they get to be adults, we see them following Christ and using their lives in a positive way. It brings tremendous joy. But every stage of the journey has its own joys and its own challenges. So, while you're working through the challenges, don't forget to enjoy your time with your children.
So again, let's just, before we let you go, talk about what is available at your website. We have a link there to, again, 5lovelanguages.com, and it's the number 5. But again, you don't have to even type all that out. Just click the link. As you go there, let's again talk about all the resources, including this book, that are available to any of our listeners, videos and other resources. So, Dr. Gary Chapman, what can people find when they land on that website?
Well, you'll find a brief description of all of my books there. And for those who are in small groups, you'll often find a guide there that you can use in leading a small group through some of my books. And you'll also find information on where I'm doing live conferences. There's other helps available there. So a lot of things at 5lovelanguages.com.
Well, again, don't forget to get some of those other books. And I also mentioned Growing Up Social, as well as, of course, the 5 Love Language series. And this book that we've been talking about today, Things I Wish I'd Known Before We Became Parents. Gary Chapman, we value our relationship with you. Thank you so very often for your joy and for the opportunity to really spend some time learning from you and to enjoy your great sense of humor and the way in which you write these books. So thank you for joining us on Point of View today.
Well, thank you, Kerby. I always enjoy chatting with you.
And it's just a great honor. And again, let me commend to you, Dr. Gary Chapman has helped millions prepare for marriage, and again, wants to help you in this book to prepare for your kids. Just before we go, let me just mention that over the last 2 hours, we've covered quite a bit, and that is so typical here on Point of View. First hour, we talked about prophecy in the Middle East and rapture and tribulation and all sorts of kind of heavier topics. I thought this would be appropriate in the second hour to maybe lighten it up a little bit. Things I wish I'd known before we became parents. And if you've been taking notes, you went through all 12 of those very important principles. But again, I would encourage you to get a copy of the book so that you can apply those to your life. And you might say, well, my kids are grown, or I don't have kids, I'm not married, but you probably know someone that would probably benefit from this book. And by the way, almost always we are looking for a book to give to expectant couples. This is probably the book to give to them. So wanted to spend some time talking about it today here on Point of View. Just before we go, do want to encourage you during this Resurrection Week to think about not only what Christ did for us on the cross, and certainly to celebrate his resurrection on Sunday. But I hope you'll also consider how you might support this ministry. And if you can do so, thank you so very much for those of who that have actually supported this ministry. But if you've never supported Point of View, could I maybe ask even a small gift that you could send? You can go to the website, pointofview.net, click on that banner that says Join the Truth Team. And again, as I've said on many occasions, we would really encourage some of you to think about supporting us on a monthly basis. We've suggested, for example, $1 a day, which is $30 a month, or $360 a year. That might be something you can do, and so I hope that you would visit the website, or even as we're going off the air, the pledge line number 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Good Friday tomorrow. We'll play a tape. We'll be back live on Monday. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Jamila. We'll see you back here next time.